I was halfway through chopping firewood behind my cabin when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I turned and saw it, her beige Lexus, crawling up my private road like a predator stalking prey. She parked right in front of the no trespassing sign. Here we go again. Evelyn Krause, president of the Elk Pines Homeowners Association. The woman had the voice of a malfunctioning smoke alarm and the personality of a thorn bush. I'd dealt with her nonsense before, back when I lived in the main neighborhood 2 miles down the hill. But now that I'd bought this old hunting cabin, which sat just outside the official HOA boundaries, I figured I was finally rid of her. I was wrong. She stepped out in her immaculate white sneakers, not a speck of dirt on her, clipboard in hand, oversized sunglasses on, blazer pressed like she was headed to a boardroom, not a forested slope in Montana. "Elliot Carter," she snapped, marching up like she owned the land. "I'm here for your quarterly inspection." I leaned on the axe handle. Inspection for what? For compliance. "We have new visual standard guidelines for all properties associated with Elk Pines." I raised an eyebrow. "This cabin isn't under the HOA. It never was. That's why I bought it." She sniffed. "It's within visual range of the lower loop. And we had a committee vote. We're extending influence over all adjacent properties. Visual harmony matters." I laughed. Couldn't help it. "You can't just extend influence because you don't like the view." Her lips tightened. "If you refuse the inspection, I'll have to report you for non-compliance." "Report me to who?" "You don't have jurisdiction here." She stepped 1 foot onto the porch. That's when I snapped. "Off my property, Evelyn. You're being hostile." "No, I'm being legal." "You're trespassing. Leave." She hesitated, then turned and stomped back to her car, muttering something about seeing me in court. I figured that'd be the end of it. Just another HOA scare tactic that would blow over. I underestimated her. 3 days later, I got a letter taped to my cabin door. No postage, just a typed notice claiming I owed $300 in non-compliance visual violation fines and demanding I remove my unsightly woodpile and repaint my cabin in neutral earth tones. She'd even included a swatch booklet. That's when I knew it was war. The morning after the fake fine notice, I took my coffee outside and sat on the porch rail, staring at the ridiculous letter she'd taped to my door. The audacity of it still clung to me like smoke from last night's firewood. Repaint the cabin? Remove the woodpile? I folded the letter, slid it into a file folder with the others, and walked back inside. My printer was already humming. I'd been gathering documents since Evelyn first showed her surgically frozen face up here. Plat maps, property deeds, the original HOA charter, everything I needed to prove she was blowing smoke. This wasn't just some cranky woman overstepping. This was targeted harassment. By noon, I had the paperwork in order and emailed a copy to my attorney, Dennis Miles. He used to be a federal prosecutor before retiring early to a quieter life upstate. We'd been friends since college, and I helped him rebuild a deck last fall. In return, he'd offered to handle any legal nonsense I ran into up here, free of charge. Dennis called later that afternoon. "She's bluffing," he said. "That property was never under the HOA's control. She has no legal authority to impose fines, codes, or inspections. She left the letter like she was the IRS. Doesn't matter. It's fabricated. But if she's claiming jurisdiction, we can hit her for misrepresentation. If she sent similar notices to anyone else, that's a pattern. Possibly even mail fraud if she's used the postal system. She hand-delivered mine. Still harassment. Did you record your last interaction? Security camera caught the whole thing." He exhaled slowly. "Good. Let's build a file." By the next evening, I had copies of everything printed, organized, and labeled. I'd also sent in a FOIA request to the county zoning board to double-check the HOA's boundary filings. If Evelyn had tampered with any maps or documents to justify her little power trip, I'd find it. Meanwhile, I started hearing from folks in the valley. Rick, a retired firefighter who lived just beyond the main subdivision, called to say he'd gotten a similar letter, same fake fine, same demand to remove non-standard structures. His structure was a chicken coop. Then there was Mallory, a florist who ran her business out of a converted garage attached to her home. Evelyn had shown up unannounced and told her she'd be fined for commercial activity in a residential zone. Mallory had laughed in her face, but the next day, her mailbox was stuffed with HOA letters, each more aggressive than the last. Evelyn wasn't bluffing. She was escalating. So was I. By the end of the week, I'd compiled 9 separate complaints from people who lived outside the HOA's legal boundaries, people Evelyn had no right to govern. Some had paid the fines out of fear. Others ignored them and got threats of liens, even though no legal mechanism existed for her to place one. I passed it all to Dennis. "This is bigger than I thought," he said. "She's impersonating a governing body to collect funds illegally. That's wire fraud, mail fraud, and potentially extortion. You think we've got enough to press charges? If she's pocketing the money, yes. If she funneled it into the HOA account, we'll need to dig into misuse of funds. Either way, we're past civil territory now." The next morning, I drove down to the county office with a copy of my deed and a request to speak to the zoning records clerk. Her name was Judy, and she had a voice like gravel and a brain sharp enough to slice marble. I showed her the letter and the map Evelyn had included. Judy frowned and pulled out the official boundary record. "This is the original charter map," she said, tapping her finger on a thick manila folder. "Hasn't changed since 1989. Anything outside this red line? Not their jurisdiction." I held up Evelyn's map. "Then why does this one show the boundary extending all the way to my ridge?" Judy narrowed her eyes. "Because this has been doctored. Think I could get a certified copy of yours? I'll do you one better. I'll notarize it and log the discrepancy. This one she gave you? That's a felony if she submitted it to any official body." Back at the cabin, I filed the notarized copy with the rest of my evidence. I was ready. I waited until Saturday morning, when the HOA board held their monthly meeting at the Elk Pines clubhouse. They always met in the upstairs lounge, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the fake stone fireplace that looked like it came out of a catalog for rich people pretending to camp. I walked in wearing jeans and a flannel, carrying a cardboard box full of documents. The room went quiet as I crossed to the front. Evelyn was seated at the long polished table, flanked by 2 board members. She looked up, eyes narrowing. "You're not a member. This meeting is for residents only." "I'm not here to join," I said, setting the box down. "I'm here to serve you." She blinked. I pulled out the summons and laid it in front of her. "You're being sued for harassment, misrepresentation, and unauthorized collection of fees. You've sent fraudulent notices to at least 9 households, all outside the HOA's jurisdiction." Her face went red. "This is absurd. You can't just storm in here. I have notarized zoning records from the county," I said, pulling out copies. "I have video evidence of your trespassing. I have letters with your signature threatening liens you can't legally place. I've got witnesses, receipts, and a certified map proving you forged boundary expansions." She shot a glance at the board members, but neither of them moved to defend her. One leaned back and folded his arms. The other stared at the table. "Furthermore," I continued, "your map, this one, was submitted to the township clerk's office as justification for action against properties like mine. That's a criminal offense. You have no standing here," she whispered. Dennis stepped through the doorway right then, carrying his own file folder. "He does now. I filed the complaint with the county sheriff this morning. You'll be contacted for questioning." The silence that followed was thick enough to chew. Evelyn's hand trembled as she reached for the papers. Her voice cracked. "This is a misunderstanding. I was acting in the community's best interest." Dennis didn't flinch. "That's not a defense. It's a motive." She stood too fast, knocking over her chair. "You're trying to ruin me." "No," I said. "You did that yourself. You abused authority you never had, fabricated documents, and harassed people who just wanted to be left alone." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the pine trees beyond the window. Evelyn crumpled into her seat, eyes glassy. The board members didn't say a word. I walked out with Dennis, the box under my arm. "You think the sheriff will move on this?" I asked. "He already has. They're pulling HOA bank records today. If she's been cashing those fake fines into the general fund or worse, into a private account, this ends with her in cuffs." As we reached my truck, Dennis paused. "You know," he said, "it's not just about stopping her. It's about what comes next. These people need someone who actually respects the law to help put things back together." I raised an eyebrow. "Not me," he added. "I've had enough boardrooms for one lifetime." I looked up at the ridgeline, where my cabin stood nestled among the trees. "I'll think about it," I said. But I already knew. By the following Tuesday, Evelyn Krause was front-page news. The local paper, the Pine County Ledger, ran with the headline, "HOA President Under Investigation for Fraudulent Fines and Forgery." The article included a photo of her exiting the Elk Pines clubhouse with a sheriff's deputy walking 2 steps behind, and a quote from the county clerk confirming that the HOA's submitted boundary map did not match any recorded documents. After that, the calls started. The first was from Wally Greaves, a no-nonsense rancher who lived north of the subdivision. He'd been trying to build a steel barn for his horses, but Evelyn had blocked his county permit by sending in a community objection form, signed only by herself. Now he knew why it had been flagged. "She forged my signature," Wally said. "I never saw that form." Then came Grace and Tom Leary, a retired couple who lived on a wooded acre near the old mill road. Evelyn had warned them their solar panels were unauthorized fixtures and threatened to have their power cut. They'd paid over $1,000 in compliance fees just to avoid trouble. Dennis added every new account to the file, cataloging names, dates, and amounts. His office now had 2 drawers dedicated to the case and a growing list of people who'd been manipulated or intimidated. Meanwhile, Evelyn vanished. Her Lexus didn't appear in the HOA parking lot. Her house, one of the biggest on the loop, sat quiet, blinds drawn. The clubhouse newsletter skipped its usual delivery. The board was radio silent. But then something strange happened. A letter arrived, not from Evelyn, but from the HOA's treasurer, a man named Philip Decker. It was printed on official letterhead, but it was different, apologetic, even. The letter read, "The Elk Pines Homeowners Association is currently undergoing a full audit. All fines, fees, and communications issued outside of our officially recognized jurisdiction are hereby suspended pending review. If you believe you were sent notices in error, please submit a written statement by certified mail." Dennis called me after reading it. "She's thrown them into panic mode," he said. "They're trying to get ahead of the investigation, probably hoping to avoid liability by distancing themselves." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the slope behind my cabin. The first hints of early autumn were creeping into the aspens. "You think they'll throw her under the bus?" "They're already lifting the bumper." That's when the sheriff called. Not a deputy, the sheriff himself. Sheriff Alton Red had been in office for nearly 20 years and ran the department with the kind of calm grit you only earned after years of dealing with both wildlife and wild folks. He invited me down to the station. "I'd like you to look at something," he said. When I arrived, he walked me past the front desks and into his office, where a folder lay open on his desk. Inside were scanned copies of bank deposit slips, 35 of them each for different amounts, none of which matched any publicly reported HOA revenue. These were taken from her home office, Alton said, filed under miscellaneous dues. We found no matching entries in the official HOA account. I studied the slips. The dates went back almost a year. She was collecting personal payments? Looks that way. Some people paid cash. Others wrote checks made out directly to her. She never deposited them into the HOA's bank. Dennis arrived 10 minutes later and took one look at the evidence before closing the folder. She's done. That's wire fraud, tax evasion, and misappropriation of funds. You'll get a full confession the moment her lawyer sees these. Alton nodded. We've got a warrant to pull her email server and HOA communications. If she used her position to threaten legal action while personally profiting, we're filing federal charges. But the real twist came that Friday. A contractor named Manuel Ortiz walked into the station with a folder of his own. He ran a small fencing and grading company and had been hired 6 months earlier to install a new perimeter fence near the upper ridge. But the work order didn't come from the HOA, it came from Evelyn directly. She said it was for community safety. Manuel told Alton and me. Said the HOA would reimburse me. Then she paid in cash. No receipts. Told me not to talk to anyone about it. He handed over a map drawn in pen on printer paper, showing a proposed extension of the HOA boundary. The same fake line Evelyn had tried to enforce on my land. She was trying to make it look real, I said. Dennis flipped through the folder. She used this as justification to threaten residents. This isn't just fraud. It's a manufactured paper trail. Alton sighed. She built a fake jurisdiction to justify collecting real money. The arrest came the next morning. Evelyn was picked up at her sister's house outside of town. The sheriff brought her in quietly, but word spread fast. By noon, half the county knew. When they brought her into the courthouse, she wore the same crisp blazer she'd shown up in that first day at my cabin. But it hung looser now, and her face had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept. I was called to testify the following week. Not in court yet, but during an official deposition at the prosecutor's office. They wanted to establish a timeline and verify the authenticity of the video footage from my security camera. Afterward, the assistant DA told me something I didn't expect. She tried to claim she was acting on behalf of the HOA, but the board issued a written statement saying she acted alone. They're rejecting all responsibility. She'll take the fall? She's already facing 9 felony charges. If she wants to cut a deal, she'll have to give up everything she's got. The fallout didn't stop there. The HOA board was forced to hold an emergency election by state order. The county issued a temporary injunction halting all HOA activity until the new board could be seated. And somehow I got nominated. Not interested, I told Dennis when he called to tell me. Too late, he said. Your name's already on the ballot. 12 residents wrote you in. So I showed up to the first open meeting not to run, just to observe, and found over 100 people packed into the clubhouse, many of whom I'd never seen before. They weren't there for the usual HOA business. They were there to make sure it never happened again. People stood up one by one and told their stories about threats, intimidation, illegal fines, and how afraid they'd been to speak out. One man admitted he'd sold his boat because of a non-compliance dispute that didn't legally exist. By the end of the night, a motion passed unanimously. Every HOA decision going forward would require public transparency, third-party audits, and mandatory disclosure of board actions. They even voted to rename the association. Evelyn's legacy was being erased one policy at a time. I walked out of that meeting and stood in the parking lot under the fading stars, my breath fogging in the cool air. Dennis joined me, hands in his coat pockets. You know, he said, you could have moved anywhere. Why this place? I looked toward the ridge, where the outline of my cabin just barely caught the moonlight. I didn't move here to hide from people, I said. I moved here to be left alone. Turns out, sometimes you have to stand up just to keep your peace. He nodded. You did more than stand up. You cleaned house. I didn't say anything, just watched the wind move through the trees and listened to the quiet. After everything Evelyn tried, after the fake fines, the forged maps, the personal scams and fake inspections, she was now awaiting trial. The rest of us? We were finally free. The trial date was set for early November, and the first frost had already settled over the valley. I spent the last days of October cutting deadfall behind the cabin, stacking it in tight rows beneath the tin awning I'd reinforced with salvaged cedar posts. My hands were numb most mornings, but I didn't mind. Work made the waiting easier. Evelyn's name hadn't been spoken in town for weeks, not in public anyway. People had moved on fast once the board was gutted and the bylaws rewritten. Her house sat empty, its shutters drawn like closed eyelids. The lawn had gone wild, ironic, considering she once fined a neighbor for letting their grass grow past 4 inches. Dennis kept me updated. He was working with the county prosecutor now, helping prep exhibits and organizing deposition transcripts from the residents Evelyn had targeted. The case wasn't just about money anymore. It had taken a darker turn, one nobody expected. He called one night just after dusk. She didn't stop with fake fines, he said. We pulled authorization forms she submitted to the county utility board. She reported non-existent safety violations to have people's water meters flagged for inspection. I leaned against the porch railing, heart slowing. How many? 7 that we've confirmed. She filed under a false title, signed them using a made-up role, municipal liaison officer. It doesn't exist. But 3 of those requests led to actual shutoffs. One family was without water for 5 days before figuring out what happened. Why would the county act on that? She used her connections. Her sister-in-law handles clerical processing at the utilities office. We've got her interview on tape. She thought Evelyn had authority. Never questioned it. I didn't say anything for a moment. Was anyone hurt? One elderly woman was hospitalized for dehydration. Lived alone, no family nearby. Thought she'd been evicted. That changed everything. The case was reclassified as criminal abuse of authority with reckless endangerment. The county sheriff's department began serving subpoenas to former board members, not just Evelyn. 2 of them had signed off on letters they claimed they'd never seen before. One resigned and left the state. The day the trial began, I sat in the back row of the courthouse gallery wearing the same jacket I used for woodcutting, worn denim, lined with wool. I didn't dress for them. I dressed for me. The courtroom was packed. Evelyn sat at the defense table in a dull gray suit, not her usual spotless whites or pastels. Her hair was tied back tight and low. No makeup. She looked older than I remembered. Not tired, hollow. She didn't look at me when I walked in. The prosecution started with the simpler charges: unauthorized fines, forged maps, falsified boundary claims. They laid out the timeline in sharp detail, using the notarized documents I'd helped collect. Witnesses followed: Rick, Mallory, Wally. Each told their story without embellishment. Then came the bombshell. Dennis took the stand as a legal expert and introduced the utility board filings. When the prosecution displayed one of the forms on the overhead screen, the room went quiet. The signature was unmistakably Evelyn's. Her attorney objected, claimed no intent to harm, only overzealous enforcement. The judge shut it down immediately. Reckless endangerment didn't care about intent. The most damning testimony came from a woman named Lorna McKinley, the elderly woman who'd been hospitalized. I never received a warning, she said, voice trembling. One day, I turned on the faucet and nothing came out. I thought it was a mistake. I walked down to the neighbor's place to ask, but I slipped on the ice halfway there. Broke my wrist. I was alone in the cold for hours before someone found me. She paused, swallowing hard. There was a sticker on my door when I got back from the hospital. It said, "Unfit for occupancy." Signed by the HOA. The courtroom was still as stone. Evelyn didn't look up once. The defense tried to paint her as misinformed, misguided, overwhelmed by the pressures of volunteer leadership. But the emails sunk that ship fast messages recovered from her personal laptop, including one she sent to a board member shortly before Lorna's shutoff. They won't listen unless we make them uncomfortable. Sometimes discomfort is the only language these people understand. The jury didn't need long. They returned the verdict in under 4 hours. Guilty on 6 counts of fraud, 3 counts of falsifying public records, and 1 count of reckless endangerment. Sentencing was scheduled for the following week. Outside the courthouse, news crews clustered near the steps. But the crowd wasn't loud. No one cheered. No one jeered. The whole thing carried a strange, heavy silence, like the weight of what she'd done still hadn't fully settled. I stayed back, hands in my coat pockets, watching from the sidewalk across the street. Dennis came out a few minutes later, flipping through a legal pad. "She's looking at 5 to 7 years minimum," he said. "Could be more if the judge orders consecutive terms. Think she'll appeal? She can try, but the evidence is airtight." We walked toward his car, gravel crunching beneath our boots. "You did more than testify," he said. "You started the chain that brought the whole thing down. I didn't do it for credit. I know. That's why it mattered." The following week, I returned to the cabin and got back to work. The land didn't care about courtrooms or verdicts. The trees still dropped their leaves, the creek still ran cold, and the frost still crept across the windows each morning like slow-moving lace. But something had changed. The new HOA board, now calling themselves the Elk Pines Community Cooperative, sent out notices inviting public forums every other month. No more closed meetings. No more power games. A rotating committee of volunteers handled routine tasks: road maintenance, snow plowing, the occasional community potluck. No one mentioned Evelyn. She was sentenced to 6 years in state custody with parole eligibility after 4. Her assets were seized to repay the illegal fines, utility penalties, and damages to those affected. Her house was sold at auction. It went to a young couple with 2 kids. They put in a tire swing and painted the shutters a bright blue. One afternoon in late winter, the father walked up my road with a thermos of coffee and asked about the best way to reinforce a roofline for heavy snow. I showed him how I'd done mine, and we talked for an hour about insulation and cedar beams. He didn't ask about Evelyn either. He didn't need to. The valley remembered, but it didn't linger. Justice had come not as vengeance, but as a steady, deliberate correction. The system had worked, but only because people stood up when it mattered. I stood on my porch that evening, thermos still warm in my hands, and watched the wind roll down from the ridge. The air was quiet now, undisturbed. The kind of quiet that meant something had settled in its rightful place. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to watch my back. I just listened to the trees.
The sun was barely up when I heard the sharp knock on my cabin door. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not the HOA's self-appointed queen, Karen. She stood there with a clipboard in hand, that smug smile plastered across her face like she'd already won some battle I didn't even know I was in. Without even a greeting, she announced, "I'm here to perform an inspection." I looked at her, confused, because my cabin was miles away from the HOA's little suburban empire. I'd bought it as a weekend getaway, far outside their jurisdiction, and I knew for a fact they had no authority here. I calmly told her no. She blinked like she'd just been slapped. "Excuse me? You can't refuse an HOA inspection," she snapped. I reminded her, again, that this was private property, not part of the HOA, and she had zero right to be here. Her face turned red. She accused me of hiding illegal modifications and unauthorized landscaping as if I had smuggled in a herd of goats to graze on HOA-approved grass. When I still didn't budge, she tried to push past me. That's when I stepped forward, blocking the doorway, and told her to leave before I called the sheriff. She stomped away, muttering threats, but I knew this wasn't over. Sure enough, 2 days later, I received a letter claiming I owed thousands in HOA fines for violations she had documented during her inspection. I laughed. It was all fabricated. Not a single claim was true. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to make this hurt for her. I called my lawyer, handed over every scrap of correspondence, and filed a harassment and trespassing complaint. A week later, I saw her again. This time, I was the one holding papers. Her smile faded the moment she realized what they were: official legal summons. She sputtered, asking if this was really necessary. I told her it was more than necessary, it was overdue. Her voice cracked as she claimed she was just doing her job. But the truth was written all over her face. She knew she'd crossed the line, and now she was caught. The HOA tried to back her up, but the court documents were clear. She had no jurisdiction, no permission, and no right to set foot on my land. When the hearing came, she avoided eye contact the whole time. The judge dismissed every bogus fine and issued a restraining order preventing her from coming near my property again. As I walked out of the courthouse, I couldn't help but smile. Karen had walked up to my door thinking she could intimidate me. She left crying, clutching legal papers, finally realizing that some people can't be bullied, and that not every cabin is part of her little kingdom. This story made by HOA Voice